Becky Nix, who is the Bridge Management Engineer for the Utah Department of Transportation. She is both the Bridge Inspection Program Manager and the Bridge Load Rating Program Manager for the Utah Department of Transportation.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what our historical funding is and how we went about getting some additional preservation funding, and then how we're prioritizing projects and selecting projects in order to use that additional funding that we've been able to receive. In about 2014, we started looking at our inventory, and Utah has one of the best conditions of bridges throughout the country. At that point, we had 1.2% of our NHS deck area in poor condition. And we knew that was going down because we had been very proactive about programming all of our poor condition bridges, making sure that they were on our 5-year plan, and we were moving forward with getting those either rehabilitated or replaced. So we knew that was going down, but we also had 39% of our bridges in fair condition, with the understanding that as our system was getting older and our average age was getting older, that those fair condition bridges were going to be increasing. So we've now gone down to 0.4% of our NHS decks in poor condition, but we're up to 45% of them in fair condition. So in 2014, we started looking at a really global systematic approach to how we could identify what funding was needed in order to address our system as a whole. At that point, we weren't fully implemented into element level data as far as the new AASHTO elements, but we did look at our NBI component ratings and said pretty much anything in good condition, we would do a high level preservation treatment on it. If it was in fair condition, we would be doing a rehabilitation on it. And then if it was in poor condition, we would be looking at a replacement. And we found some average square foot cost for this and applied this out system-wide. So from there, we started looking at, if we did this, what would our overall health index of our bridges be, and where we needed those funding levels in order to meet our NHS inventories targets, as well as our state-owned bridges off of the NHS. And we have also started funding locally owned bridges on the federal aid system in order to get rid of their poor condition bridges as well. So we started looking at this, and we looked at what bridge funding we had historically had. At the time, we had $18.5 million coming in total to our program. We also understood that we had a lot of capacity projects that were happening, and so we were getting funding from those areas. And also some of our roadway preservation projects were taking care of some of our bridge deck overlays. So we looked at that as an average and looked at what our total needs would be in order to meet our targets, and we came in at about $65 million. So we had quite a bit of a deficit that we were looking at in order to meet those targets and not have our overall conditions drop below what we felt was acceptable. At the time, in 2013 and 14 and 15, we were about $3.5 million that we were putting towards preservation, which was not meeting the needs. In 2016, our legislature had approved a gas tax increase. And so by identifying that we had these needs and we had the shortfall that was there, we assumed we were getting about $15 to $20 million through capacity projects and preservation projects, but we still needed to be around $45 to $50 million in dedicated bridge funding in order to meet these needs. So through the gas tax and also some reallocation of other funds throughout the state, we were able to go from $18.5 million in 2015 to $48 million in 2019. So we went from $3.5 million towards preservation for all of our bridges to $22 million that we were applying in 2019. Utah's been really proactive about tracking our conditions, looking at projections, and trying to set targets and meet those targets. And so one of the other areas we were able to get funding from was our high volume pavements. They had been watching and setting targets for those high volume pavements for an extended amount of time, and they had met and exceeded where they were at for their targets. So at that point, they were able to reallocate some of those federal funds both to bridges and low volume pavements. And so it really was a good demonstration of that cross-asset look of, yes, we are meeting it here, we are exceeding it here in our pavements. Now we can readjust those funds and move them to the areas where we're not projecting that we will be meeting our targets. When we got the additional funding starting in 2016, there was also somewhat of a shift in how that funding was allocated to us. In the past, we had always been given dedicated funding that went to our rehabilitation and replacement projects, but we also had dedicated funding that was going to our preservation projects. We were given a lot more flexibility, and we were told that we were the ones that knew what our bridges needed and what was most conducive to meeting our performance targets for the bridges, and so we were kind of given an open opportunity to evaluate that on an annual basis of how much we felt needed to go to rehabilitation and replacement and how much we felt needed to go to preservation. So it gave us a lot more flexibility to make sure that we were meeting our condition needs, but also making that proactive approach. And so that amount that goes to preservation fluctuates every year. Usually we start with, Utah has a target that we will have all of our poor condition bridges funded within 5 years. As soon as it goes to a poor condition, it goes onto our STIP and will be either rehabilitated or replaced within 5 years. So that's our top priority of our $48 million, is any condition or any bridges that have gone to poor condition within that year. Next, as we start to look at some of our low fair condition or bridges that we expect are going to be going into poor condition in the upcoming year. So we'll put funding towards that, and we usually shoot for about a 50-50 split between condition-based projects and preservation-style projects. And we've stayed pretty close to that with our preservation and rehabilitation funding splits over the last couple years. As part of that, we have been collecting element level data for all of our bridges, state and locally owned, since 2014. And from that, we've gone from looking at sufficiency rating, which has been kind of put to rest at this point, and we've developed a bridge health index that we look at. First of all, we use this for our rehabilitation and replacement because that is a condition-based program. We break it up into our deck score, superstructure score, and substructure score. We put the highest value towards the deck score because that is the riding surface. That is what is seeing the most wear and tear. That is what the traveling public is seeing. And that's where we really take a hit if we have deficiencies. That's what the public is seeing. And also deficiencies in the deck then translates down to potentially accelerated deficiencies in our superstructure and substructure. So we take a composite of all of the elements that fit into that deck component. They're weighted by their asset value so that smaller items like your joints maybe don't play into your overall health index for your deck quite as much as, say, the deck itself, or the parapets play in a little bit heavier than some of the other ones as they're a safety concern and a higher dollar asset. We calculate the superstructure and substructure scores in the same way, doing that composite number of each of the individual elements and weighting it based on condition. So part of it that goes into that would be our element health index, and that's pretty much just taking reduction factors for whatever percentage of your quantities are in condition state 2, 3, and 4. So if you were 100% in condition state 1, you would have an element health index of 1. But as you start getting more of your condition in condition state 2, 3, and 4, that health index is going to drop. We use our bridge health index for our prioritization for our rehabilitation and replacement program, but we use our element indices as an individual measure to start looking at some of our preservation programs. We have 3 main focus areas that we look at when we're setting up our bridge preservation programs. We really feel like doing a deck overlay program and a paint program for our steel girders is really going to give us the best bang for our buck as a preservation strategy. Those are the systems that are protecting our major components, and if we can keep our overlays in good condition, we can keep water out of our decks, then we feel like we're extending that life. And the same with our steel girders. As soon as you start losing capacity in your girders because you're not keeping up with your paint, it goes from being a very small project to a very costly, potentially a bridge replacement project. And we also have started in the last 3 years doing a bridge maintenance program, and I'll go into a little more detail on that one in just a few minutes. Looking at our bridge deck overlay prioritization, one of our main focus areas is trying to get some sort of seal on all of our bare decks as best we can. So because there is no overlay in place, the bare decks are assigned a 0 score for their overlay health index. We also look at prioritization of the existing overlays that are in place and trying to prioritize those overlays that are in the worst condition, getting out and doing projects and replacing those overlays proactively before we start getting degradation of the decks. So right now, where our bare decks are all kind of rated as a 0 for our element health index, we have to look at a couple different ways that we can start to prioritize those. We've started looking at a lot of our higher volume roads. We're definitely focusing on our interstates and trying to get overlays on as many of our interstate bridges as we can. We also look at our high dollar bridges, our long span bridges, our trusses, our arches, those higher dollar bridges that would be more costly to do a deck replacement or a major rehabilitation on. The other thing that we have started doing within the last 6 months is collecting defect data for all of our elements. So now we're not only differentiating the condition states, but we're going in and differentiating, is our condition state based on cracking? Is it based on staining? Is it based on open potholes? And so that way we can kind of start to look at it and say, it makes sense to go out and put an overlay on a bridge deck that has a lot of cracking present, but maybe doesn't have open potholes yet because it hasn't reached that level of deterioration, and we're still in that proactive mode that we're sealing out the decks before it gets to the point that we need to be doing a more major project, and we've already passed that point of being able to do just preservation. The other thing that we really try to do is look at geographically, where can we get multiple bridges at the same time and package them into a project. That way we're able to get economy of scale. We're mobilizing crews once, and as those quantities increase and we're doing more bridges in the same area, that unit cost of our overlays is going down. The next area that we're looking at is our paint program. And this is an area that we're still trying to find a little bit of a balance on between being reactive with our paint program and being proactive with it. We have a lot of our paint systems that have already failed, and they're to the point that they need to be replaced before we start seeing degradation of the steel girders. The other aspect of it, though, is trying to address them and clean and overcoat those paint systems before they reach the point of failure. Then you can get out and clean and overcoat, and you're not doing a full clean and repaint, and you're coming in at a fraction of the cost. So one of the major projects that we're looking at right now is just prior to the Olympics coming to Utah in 2001, we replaced around 160 bridges in the Salt Lake Valley. Almost half of those were steel superstructures, and they're hitting right about 20 years of life right now. We're starting to see fading and dulling of the paint. We're seeing very localized failures. No, they're not the worst in our system. They're not necessarily starting to see corrosion of the steel below, but we are starting to see that degradation of the paint system. And so we want to get out and proactively address those at a fraction of the cost of if we waited 10 years and now we were seeing full failures and we had to go out and do full clean and repaint of those bridges. We're looking at doing about 20 bridges as part of that project, and it's over 1 million square feet of painting that has to happen. So we're looking for a clean and overcoat of about $24 million that we're spreading out over 3 years in order to proactively address those, where we would be at least double that cost if we were going out and cleaning and repainting them a few more years down the road once we started to see full system failures. So right now we're still working on that balance between how much of our paint funding do we put towards the proactive cleaning and overcoating, and how much do we do towards our reactive programs and getting those fully failed paint systems replaced. The next program that we have going, so unlike, it sounds like a lot of the states here, we don't have dedicated maintenance forces for our structures. We have general maintenance forces, and the rumor I hear from them is they get about $600 a bridge a year to do maintenance on bridges. That'll let them drive out to the bridge, they can take a look at it and maybe blow out one joint and they're done. So they haven't been able to address a lot of these little critical items that they're seeing that are maintenance items that we're not going to go out and do a full project for, but they're constantly going out to the bridges. They're constantly trying to keep some of these potholes filled. So we set aside a portion of our preservation funding and set up predefined procurement contracts with predefined bid items and predefined prices that were in place for 3 years. And once a year, we reach out to all of our maintenance stations throughout the state. And we say, okay, in your region, what are your top 5 bridge needs? Where do you have the worst potholes or a poor overlay that is just causing maintenance nightmares for you guys? And how can we help provide that support? And also, we bring them out during the construction of these so that they start seeing how that work is done, and they're getting a little bit more proactive of watching for some of it and understanding how some of their activities or not doing some of their activities is accelerating this degradation. So this has been a really good project or program for us to be able to start coordinating back with our maintenance stations, helping them be aware and also giving them support that they didn't previously have. And so we can get out and we can address some of these potholes before they become something that's more major. The next thing that we're kind of looking at, and our pavement group has done a really good job of this, is looking at what they're calling a sustainability index. So going through each of our bridge overlay types, looking at what our total statewide quantities are, and looking at what those anticipated life cycles are for an overlay. Right now, we're kind of estimating that a thin bonded polymer overlay will last us about 15 years. An asphalt overlay would last us about 10 years. And some of our rigid overlays, like our polyester concrete, should be lasting us about 25 years. So we know what the total quantities are. We know what the cycles are. And so now we can back calculate it back and say, okay, based on that and a 10-year life cycle of our asphalt on our bridges, we need to be doing X number of square feet of asphalt overlay replacement. We need to be doing Y number of thin bonded polymer overlay replacement in a given year in order to stay ahead of that curve and not get to where we're dropping condition and we're keeping our overlays in good condition. From that, right now, we're working on starting to set those targets of how much we need to be doing a year. And this is also going to give us a chance to reevaluate our preservation funding. If we know that we have to be doing a certain amount every year, we know roughly what our program value needs to be. So this gives us an opportunity to start having those discussions of, yeah, we probably have enough preservation funding for now, but in 2 or 3 years, it won't be enough. Or if we don't start getting increases now, we're going to be way behind the 8 ball in 5 to 7 years. So then we can also start developing a cyclical plan. We can start looking at geographic areas and knowing, area 1 is going to get all of its thin bonded overlays replaced in year 1 of a decade, and then the next area is year 2 of a decade, and then we have a cycle and a plan for each of those preservation activities moving forward. Once we get this kind of established for our deck overlays, we're going to start looking at this for our paint programs as well. And then another big part of this is starting to really leverage those pavement projects. If they're in the area and we know we've got a bunch of bridge decks with asphalt overlays on them, and they've got a project going through there, and ours are right at the end of the service life, we need to be coordinating up front and early with our region staff. And that way we can start leveraging their funding as well, and we can make sure that we're being as efficient with the limited funding that everybody has. If anybody's got any quick questions before we move on.
We're behind on time, and then Becky's going to be part of the panel session too, so if we can just hold questions until then.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.